Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce Sterling said to the Chief of Staff during morning briefing, nodding toward the quiet woman filling out charts at the nurse's station. The kind of woman who didn't make eye contact. The kind who kept her head down and followed orders. The kind who could be managed. He had no idea what he was looking at. Seattle General's fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song over antiseptic scrubbed hallways in San Diego, casting everything in the color of institutional sleep. Laura Bennett moved through the corridor like someone who'd learned to occupy space without disturbing it, shoulders squared, stride efficient, eyes tracking exits before patient vitals. She was in her second week of civilian nursing, and the scrubs fit her the way armor once had, with the same practiced precision and the same absolute certainty that they meant something nobody else could see. In her jacket pocket, hanging in her locker on the 3rd floor, was a faded unit patch. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Sewn into the lining by her own hands 3 years ago with a needle and thread in a forward operating base dining tent. She'd kept nothing else from Kandahar, no photographs, no letters, no medals framed on a shelf at home. Just the patch. Just the proof that Captain Laura Bennett had existed before she became this, someone civilian nurse, pushing a med cart with the same efficiency she'd once used clearing rooms. The chart in her hands was meticulous. Everything always was. Medication reconciliation down to the decimal. Vital sign trends color-coded by hand in the margins. For placements logged by site, date, and gauge. Years of training had taught her that precision saves lives, that attention to detail in a medical record was the difference between a patient who recovered and a patient who didn't. In Kandahar, she'd trained a medic named Daniel Jensen under mortar fire, teaching him how to pack a chest wound with the kind of focus that kept people breathing when everything else was trying to kill them. That same focus was in every line she wrote now, every number she verified, every form she completed. During morning rounds, Laura had noticed something. The surgical supply orders didn't match the actual usage. Room for 12 was billed for 6 cases of absorbable suture material over the past month, but the actual consumption logged was 3. Room for 19 showed 8 units of chest drainage systems, expensive ones, the kind that ran $1,400 each, but only 2 had been placed. The discrepancies were small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. Small enough that if you didn't spend 3 tours in a military field hospital learning to count supplies under pressure, you might not even register them. Laura had made a note. Not on paper. In the part of her mind that had learned to catalog information the way a sniper catalogs wind direction and distance. She would ask about the billing protocol. There was probably an explanation. But the pattern had registered, the way patterns always did for people trained to notice when something didn't add up. She was at the nurse's station when Dr. Sterling arrived for rounds. His white coat was impossibly crisp, the kind that suggested he'd never actually moved fast enough to wrinkle it. His tie was silk, probably Italian. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, the kind that cost more than Laura's monthly rent. He moved through the hospital the way he owned it, which, in his mind, he did. 23 years as Chief of Surgery at Seattle General. Board certification. Published research. Hospital board connections that went back to his father's tenure as a regional administrator. 3 generations of Sterling medicine, which meant 3 generations of doors opening before he had to knock, of phone calls answered, of problems disappearing before they could become problems. He needed them to stay that way. The billing scheme had been running for almost 7 years. Inflated surgical supply orders, phantom procedures on insurance claims, surgical times that didn't match actual documentation. It had generated almost $470,000 in fraudulent claims, money that had gone into his personal accounts, money that had renovated his house in La Jolla and paid for his daughter's private school education and kept his ex-wife's alimony current without touching his legitimate income. The federal insurance program audits were infrequent, and his connections to the hospital board meant that any internal questions about supply chain inconsistencies were redirected upward to his own oversight committee, where they died quietly. But he'd never counted on a nurse who charted like a military strategist. He'd never counted on someone whose attention to detail was so precise that she could sit at a desk and, without even fully understanding what she was seeing, spot the gaps where money disappeared. When Dr. Sterling reviewed Laura's charts that morning, he felt something shift. The way a predator feels when another predator enters the territory. Her handwriting was clean. Her reconciliations were exact. And yesterday, in the medication supply log, she'd left a note in the margin, query, surgical suite 3 supply discrepancies, recommend billing verification. A note. A small, professional, nothing note. A note that could lead someone to ask questions about those $1,400 chest drainage systems that hadn't actually been used. He smiled at her, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and moved on. But something cold and calculating had already begun moving beneath the surface of his thoughts, the way a current moves beneath still water. The current was working toward a conclusion: this nurse needed to be gone. Not because she was incompetent. Because she was too competent. Because her precision was going to lead to questions, and questions were going to lead to audits, and audits were going to lead to federal investigators with briefcases and handcuffs. He needed her gone before she stumbled onto the wrong invoice. Laura finished her shift at 7 in the evening, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room where no one else was around, and touched the jacket hanging on the hook. Her fingers found the lump of the patch through the fabric. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. It was smaller than she remembered. Time did that, made important things smaller, compressed them, pressed them down until they fit in your pocket. She'd trained Daniel Jensen in a combat support hospital 18 miles from Kandahar city. He was a good medic. Smart. Calm under pressure. The kind of person who should have been teaching people, not the other way around, but the army had assigned him to her unit and that meant she trained him. She'd taught him chest-wound packing with the same precision she taught everything, showing him how to pack the wound with gauze soaked in hemostatic agent, how to apply dressings that would stick when everything was wet with blood and sweat, how to feel when you had enough pressure on a sucking chest wound without occluding the airway. She'd taught him because people died when medics didn't know. She'd taught him because their battalion was running missions on routes that seemed to have been specifically mapped by people who wanted to find IEDs, and she knew what was coming before it came. Her final rotation ended. Jensen rotated in 2 months later. That was how it worked. You trained someone, then you left, and they took your place, and you went back to your normal life, assuming there was such a thing as normal after 3 tours in Kandahar. She hadn't expected to see him in a hospital bed. The assignment sheet during Laura's shift change the next morning showed room 347, Corporal Daniel Jensen. Admitted 2 weeks prior. IED strike, Route Falcon 7, Helmand Province. Just like that. The name that had become a ghost in her memory was suddenly physical, real, a room number on a piece of paper. Laura had stared at it for 3 full seconds while the day shift nurse gave report: multiple fractures, blast injuries to the left leg and abdomen, extensive soft tissue damage, still in traction, in and out of pain management protocols. She walked to room 347 without fully deciding to. Daniel Jensen didn't recognize her at first. The morphine and the traction and the general dissolution that came with post-blast trauma meant he was moving through the world in slow motion, his eyes tracking the ceiling. But when Laura came to the bedside and checked his chart, his hands were the same. Capable hands. The hands she'd taught to pack a chest wound under fire. The hands that had probably saved people after she left. "Morning, Corporal," she said. Standard tone. Standard professional. The voice she used with every patient. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition without context. A memory trying to surface through the morphine haze. "We trained together," she said quietly. "Kandahar. You replaced me with 3rd Battalion." His breathing pattern changed. The monitor registered it. Elevated heart rate. The kind of response that came from memory colliding with present moment, from the sudden understanding that someone from the before time was here, in this bed, in this fluorescent lit room in San Diego. "Captain," he said. His voice was rough, the way voices got after morphine and pain. "Captain Bennett." She nodded. Didn't smile. Smiled only when there was something to smile about, and this wasn't it. This was a medic she'd trained who was lying in traction after an IED hit, the exact kind of route clearance mission she'd run for the first 6 months of her deployment. This was a small, sharp reminder that there were still people running those routes. Still people hitting those roads. Still people losing legs to the same terrain she'd walked. "I'm taking good care of you now," she said. And then she left to begin her shift, moving through Seattle General's corridors with the same precision that had carried her through Kandahar, the same precision that was now putting her on a collision course with a man in an Italian silk tie who had absolutely no idea that he'd just placed his entire criminal enterprise directly under the gaze of the most dangerous person in the hospital. The shift change began at 7 in the morning, and Dr. Sterling arrived at the nurses' station like a man stepping into his own theater. 12 staff members were charting, prepping medications, reviewing patient assignments, the usual controlled chaos of a hospital morning. He slapped 5 $100 bills on the counter with the casual violence of someone who'd never worried about money. "I'm betting $500, he announced, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man accustomed to people listening, that Captain Clipboard here quits within 7 days. He gestured toward Laura, who was updating Jensen's morning labs without looking up. "Women who play soldier can't handle real medicine. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the station. Not malicious laughter, the reflexive kind that happens when authority figures give permission for cruelty. 2 residents exchanged glances. A nurse from the night shift smiled uncomfortably. Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. She continued entering her notes with the same precision she'd used to document casualty counts in field hospitals, her fingers steady on the keyboard while the laughter continued around her like ambient noise, something that existed in the background but didn't require acknowledgement. Dr. Sterling watched her for a reaction. His smile faltered for half a second when she didn't provide one. Then he laughed louder, scooped his money back up, and walked away, already calculating his next move. 3 days later, the hospital cafeteria was crowded with the usual lunch crowd, nurses between shifts, residents grabbing food before surgeries, orderlies filling trays. Laura sat alone at a corner table with soup, salad, and iced tea arranged in the precise way of someone who ate for fuel, not pleasure. She was reviewing Jensen's most recent imaging on her phone when Dr. Sterling walked past. He didn't slow down. Didn't change his expression. His hand simply connected with her tray as he passed, and the entire arrangement went airborne. The bowl of soup arced like a terrible parabola. The iced tea followed. The salad plate clattered against the tile with a sound that made 50 people turn. "Oops," he said, not turning around. "Better reflexes on the battlefield, sweetheart." The cafeteria froze in that particular way places freeze when someone has just committed a small cruelty in public. 50 people waiting to see how she would respond. Laura kneeled to begin cleaning it up. Soup pooled across the tile floor, steaming slightly. Lettuce scattered like confetti. The iced tea had shattered into a constellation of small glass pieces. Her scrubs were soaked. She used napkins to gather the larger debris, her hands moving with methodical efficiency, while staff members pretended to look away or suddenly became very interested in their plates. One measured breath. She didn't cry. Didn't curse. Didn't look at anyone else. She simply continued cleaning, soup from tile, glass fragments into a napkin, lettuce into a trash bin, and when an orderly moved to help, she nodded once to say thank you but continued alone, because accepting help would mean acknowledging that what had just happened was worth acknowledging. By the time she finished, most people had returned to eating, the moment already becoming the kind of story that gets quieter with each retelling. She ordered a fresh lunch from the line. A new bowl of soup. New salad. New tea. She sat at the same table. And she ate it alone. The next day, the corridor outside the surgical wing was moderately crowded, 2 residents moving between cases, 3 nurses restocking supply carts, an orderly pushing a bed. Laura was walking toward the medication room when Dr. Sterling emerged from his office, patient chart in hand, moving with the deliberate pace of a man about to perform. He stopped directly in her path and dropped the chart. Paper scattered across the tile floor like a crime scene, some sliding under supply carts, one landing face-up with Jensen's name visible. The whole moment had the choreographed quality of something planned. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It's the only order you'll follow correctly. Unless you want to salute first." The orderly pushing the bed found sudden interest in his task. One of the residents looked away. The other resident, a woman barely 28, kept her eyes forward but her jaw tightened, a small act of silent solidarity that Laura would not have expected and could not acknowledge. Laura kneeled to gather the pages. Each one individually. Jensen's initial intake form. Labs. Imaging reports. The physical examination notes in Dr. Sterling's handwriting. She collected them slowly, methodically, the way someone collects the pieces of something broken, and as she rose, something in her face changed, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to read expressions the way combat teaches you to. A single tear traced down her cheek. Not from sadness. Not from fear. The kind of tear that comes from holding everything together so tightly for so long that the pressure has to release somewhere, even if it's just through the eyes. She wiped it away without breaking Dr. Sterling's gaze. "I've sutured intestines back together under mortar fire, doctor," she said, her voice quiet, not soft, but quiet in the way that apex predators are quiet. "Your insecurity doesn't even register as a tremor." His smile faltered. Actually faltered, a moment of genuine discomfort crossing his face before he recovered with a laugh that sounded louder than it needed to be. He turned and walked away, and for a moment, in that hallway outside surgery, the balance of power had shifted in a way he couldn't quite quantify but could definitely feel. Laura reorganized the chart. The residents were looking at her now. The orderly had stopped his bed. She handed the chart back to Dr. Sterling as he walked away, and she didn't smile. Didn't nod. Just extended the papers with the kind of precision that came from a decade of being trained to perform under pressure, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her composure intact. But that night, everything changed. She began her shift at 11, moving through Seattle General's dimmed corridors toward Jensen's room on the 4th floor. The hospital at night had a different quality than daytime, quieter, more exposed, the kind of silence that comes from reduced staff and reduced urgency. Her ID badge clattered softly against her ribs as she walked, the sound following her like a metronome. Jensen was asleep when she entered room 347. Traction apparatus suspended his left leg. The chest tube ran from his ribcage into a collection chamber beside the bed. His oxygen saturation read 93% on the monitor, acceptable, stable, the kind of number that meant recovery was on track. She checked his vitals routine, recorded them in his chart, adjusted his morphine drip. But something in the data bothered her. A pattern that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. She spent the next 3 days in microscopically detailed observation. She documented every vital sign shift. Every tube output. Every medication administered. She cross-referenced his imaging with his surgical notes. She reviewed his daily labs with the same precision she'd used to document casualty treatment in Kandahar, where the difference between recovery and death often existed in the margins of a blood pressure reading. By the 4th night, the pattern was unmistakable. His oxygen saturation had drifted from 93 to 89 to 85. His chest tube output had decreased from 340 milliliters to 210 to 160. His breathing had become slightly labored, the kind of change so incremental that day shift might miss it, but night shift, when the hospital slowed down and nurses actually had time to think, night shift noticed everything. She was in the medication room at 3:20 in the morning, reviewing Jensen's chart by herself, when the realization hit her like a door slamming. The readings weren't natural decline. They were the pattern of a tension hemothorax. Air accumulating in the pleural space. Pressure building around his lungs. The chest tube was supposed to drain it, but something was wrong. Something was blocked or kinked or malpositioned, and if the pressure continued to build, his lungs would compress. His heart would shift. And within hours, maybe 4, maybe 6, his body would have nowhere left to breathe. She set the chart down on the medication counter. Her hands, for the first time that week, trembled slightly. But not from fear. From recognition. From understanding that the universe had arranged itself in a way that felt intentional, that the patient who needed her most was the one person in this hospital she was trained to help but had been instructed by every protocol to leave alone. Her phone buzzed. The message from Dr. Sterling: final warning. One more documentation error and you're terminated. Medical board is watching you closely. She turned the phone face down and walked toward Jensen's room. The corridor stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, and she moved through it with the kind of purpose that came from having trained for exactly this moment, the moment when every protocol, every policy, every rule said to step back and let the system work, and every instinct, every piece of her training, every fiber of her being said to move forward. The elevator doors slid open when she pressed the button. She stepped inside alone. Watched the numbers climb. 4. And then, as the doors opened onto the 4th floor, she understood that everything she'd built here at Seattle General, the careful invisibility, the quiet professionalism, the meticulous distance between her past and her present, had been leading to exactly this point. She had no idea what would happen next. But she had every idea what she was about to do. The monitor flatlined at 2:07 a.m. One continuous tone. No rhythm. Just the machine's admission of failure. Laura heard it from the supply closet where she was restocking for bags. She didn't run. Combat-trained people didn't run, they moved with purpose. She was at Corporal Jensen's bedside in 18 seconds. His chest was cyanotic. His pupils already dilating. The night resident was 2 floors up in the ICU, managing a septic bowel obstruction. The attending was 15 minutes out from the city, caught in traffic on I-5 at this hour, which meant he was maybe 10 minutes from the hospital entrance, another 5 to the trauma floor. Jensen had 90 seconds. Possibly less. The tension hemothorax was exactly what she'd diagnosed when she checked his chest tube an hour ago, the blockage she'd reported to the junior resident, who'd looked at the tube, glanced at the monitor showing normal rhythm, and assured her it was patent. But it wasn't patent. The pressure was building in the thoracic cavity around his lungs like a balloon filling. His heart couldn't beat against the pressure. His lung couldn't inflate. Everything was compressing inward. She'd seen this in Kandahar. 3 times. 2 of them made it. 1 didn't. The crash team was coming. She could hear the footsteps, the shouted response, the code blue overhead page. But they'd arrived to find a patient who was already brain dead or gone. 10 more seconds of this and his heart would arrest permanently. No drug was going to restart a heart being crushed from the outside. Laura moved to the crash cart. Her hands opened the instrument tray. Sterilization? Not today. Protocol? Not today. What mattered was the scalpel, the thin blade, the weight of it, the cold metal sliding into her palm like coming home. The lateral thoracotomy incision lived in her muscle memory. 4th intercostal space, anterior axillary line, 1 long horizontal cut between the ribs. Her hand moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this under worse conditions, under mortar fire at Kandahar airfield during the medevac surge in 2011, hand steady while rounds impacted the containers around her, while Marines bled out on stretchers, while helicopters waited and the clock was always running down. The blade parted his skin. Muscle. Fascia. Clean. Fast. No hesitation. Blood spilled across his pale chest like a spilled drink, dark and urgent. The intercostal muscles resisted, then gave way. She could hear her own breathing, steady, controlled, the pattern she'd learned to maintain when adrenaline tried to accelerate everything. The trauma shears came next. Cold steel. Grip. Cut. Cut again. The motion was identical to the combat knife work she'd done 1,000 times, quick, efficient, lethal when it needed to be, life-saving when it didn't. The pleural fluid released like a sigh. A hiss of air escaping. His lung was there. Collapsed. Compressed. The pressure that had been strangling his heart was suddenly gone, the weight lifted off in a single motion. Laura's gloved hand found his heart in the chest cavity, a muscle smaller and stranger than it seemed, still quivering with the last echoes of electrical impulse. She massaged it. Pushed the blood through. Compressed the chamber. Released. Again. Her hand moving like it was someone else's hand, like she was watching herself from above the bed, like some other version of her was doing this while she stood apart and marveled at the precision. The monitor beeped. 1 beat. Then silence. Again. Again. Sinus rhythm. Fragile. Erratic. But beating. His eyes were still dilated. No pupillary response yet. But his heart was moving blood and his lungs were expanding and he was still in the window where comeback was possible. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm into his throat. The heart monitor climbed into something approaching normal range. 84 beats per minute. 86. 90. Irregular but ascending, the rhythm stabilizing as his body recognized it was alive. The crash team arrived at 2:13 a.m., 6 people, controlled chaos, all motion and purpose. They saw the lateral thoracotomy. They saw the blood. They saw the manually restarted heart and the improvised emergency procedure that violated every single protocol written in the last 30 years of emergency medicine. Who did this? The senior resident, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone who'd just walked into a crime scene. I did, Laura said. She was still holding the trauma shears. Her glove was dark red up past the wrist. Her scrubs were painted with blood the color of rust. She met his eye and didn't blink. Tension hemothorax. Chest tube was blocked. He had 90 seconds before permanent brain damage. He needed decompression and cardiac massage. He needed it now. The resident looked at Jensen's monitor. The rhythm was still stabilizing. 92 beats. 94. The O2 sat was climbing, 68, 72, 78, moving toward something viable. You didn't wait for an attending. There was no time to wait. Her voice was level. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just a statement of fact, the tone of someone reporting what had happened the way it had happened, without editorializing, without explaining, without asking for approval that would never come. One of the residents reached out to take over the thoracotomy site, but Laura stepped back before the hand could touch. She stepped back and moved away from the bed in one motion, the way combat medics did when the patient's care transferred to the next level of provider. You did your job, then you released it. You didn't hover. You didn't defend. You moved to the side and let the next person take the next step. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:17 a.m., still buttoning his shirt, his surgeon's instinct already running calculations. He looked at Jensen's chest cavity. He looked at the crash cart. He looked at Laura. His eyes were the eyes of a chess player who'd just watched his opponent move into an unexpected position. She could see the shift in his expression, not anger, but something colder. Recognition. Opportunity. He circled the bed slowly. His hand didn't touch anything. He was committing details to memory. The scalpel. The trauma shears. The angle of the incision. The blood on the sheet. Every detail a potential weapon, a potential violation of protocol that he could weaponize with the precision of someone who understood that institutions ran on documentation and procedures and paper trails, not on heroics and unauthorized surgeries and the kind of medical decisions that should be made by attending physicians in consultation, not by night shift nurses acting as surgical teams. I need this area cleared, Dr. Sterling said quietly. His voice carried authority that made the crash team move without questioning. Everyone except Dr. Chen. Nurse Bennett, step away from the bed. She stepped away. She stripped off the contaminated gloves. 1, 2, the latex crackled like a dry husk when she peeled them off. She deposited them in the red biohazard bag and moved toward the door with the same measured pace she'd used to walk away from a dozen firefights, the pace that said she wasn't running, wasn't retreating, wasn't responding to the gravity of what had just happened. Nurse Bennett. Dr. Sterling's voice again, sharp now. Write an incident report before the end of your shift. Detailed. Every step. Every second. Every decision. I'll need to review your clinical justification for an authorized surgical procedure. Understood, Doctor. She wrote the report at 3:45 a.m. in the break room, hand steady, font precise, documenting the tension hemothorax, the blocked chest tube, the 90-second window, the lateral thoracotomy procedure, the manual cardiac massage, the moment the rhythm returned. She wrote it with the same attention to detail she'd used for after-action reviews in Kandahar, every decision justified, every step explained, nothing hidden. She knew as she wrote it that she was providing Dr. Sterling with a perfect document detailing exactly how she'd violated protocol. She knew that by 8 a.m., that report would be the foundation of a termination file. She also knew that Corporal Daniel Jensen was breathing at 3:45 a.m. because she'd cut open his chest and restarted his heart. At 5:32 a.m., with the sky still dark, Laura sat in her car in the Seattle General parking garage. Engine off. Key still in her hand. The engine would need the keys to turn. The wheels would need the engine to move. The drive home would need the car to move. She understood the chain of causality. She just couldn't seem to initiate it. She pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, the one she always carried, the one she'd never shown anyone, the Marine Corps emblem stitched onto weathered fabric, the colors faded to something that looked almost like old blood. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. 3 tours in Kandahar. 12 years of service. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart from an IED that left shrapnel in her left shoulder that she still felt when the weather changed. And now she was about to lose her nursing license for saving a life in the exact way she'd been trained to save lives. She held the patch in both hands and let her forehead rest against the steering wheel. The rain started then, or maybe it had been raining all along and she'd only just started listening to it. It hammered the windshield like applause, like accusation, like the sound of everything changing at once. The rain kept falling. Laura's forehead remained pressed against the steering wheel, her breathing shallow and measured, the controlled respiration of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on panic. 2 hours had passed since she'd walked out of Seattle General's main entrance with a cardboard box containing her scrubs, her stethoscope, and a half-empty bottle of antiseptic lotion. The parking garage smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete, the same smell that had hung over Forward Operating Base Shank in Kandahar on the day she'd stitched together a Taliban fighter's intestines and saved his life anyway, because that's what medics did. Her phone buzzed again. The 4th time in 30 minutes. Her daughter's name on the screen, Sarah, 27, a pediatrician in Portland who had inherited her mother's hands and her father's stubbornness. Laura couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she say? That she'd been fired in a windowless conference room at 9:47 a.m. by a man who smiled like he was delivering bad news to a stranger. The termination had been surgical in its precision. Dr. Sterling had walked in at exactly 9 o'clock with an HR director named Margaret Chen, a woman with kind eyes who had clearly never questioned anything Sterling told her, and a stack of documents that looked 3 inches thick when placed on the grey laminate table. Sterling had set the stack down with deliberate care, each page aligned with military precision, and begun speaking in the regretful tone of someone who had exhausted all other options. Captain Bennett, he'd said, using her first name without the title, stripping formality like a weapon. We have some serious concerns that need to be addressed. Laura had remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, watching his fingers flip through the pages with practiced efficiency. Unauthorized surgical procedures. Joint Commission Violation Code the 28th of July, 14, regarding scope of practice boundaries for registered nursing staff. Meticulously photographed contaminated instrument trays with timestamps stamped in red, 2:15 a.m., 2:16 a.m., 2:18 a.m. 3 photographs of her hands holding a scalpel that wasn't hers to hold. This wasn't a hospital setting, Sterling had continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine sorrow, so convincing she'd almost believed he actually felt it. This was reckless, unauthorized cowboy medicine. You endangered a patient's life with procedures that fall under surgical scope. Physicians perform surgery. Nurses do not. It's clear from your background that you may have confused your previous military role with your current civilian responsibilities. The stack grew heavier as he talked. Falsified medication logs attributing errors to her that she'd never made. Documentation of patient safety concerns written in her name but in Sterling's handwriting. A complaint form signed by a nurse named Patricia who worked day shift and had never spoken a word to Laura except for good morning in passing. The complaint described Laura as unstable, unable to follow protocol, potentially dangerous. Margaret Chen had nodded along, her pen moving across a page, and Laura had understood in that moment that this wasn't a meeting. It was a burial. The decision has been made at the administrative level, Sterling had said, closing the stack with finality. Protocol violations we simply cannot overlook, regardless of outcome. I'm recommending immediate termination effective immediately. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. Security will escort you to your locker to collect personal items. Laura had stood up. She'd said nothing. She'd walked to her locker in the nurses' station while former colleagues averted their eyes, the specific avoidance of people who sensed danger and chose not to acknowledge it. She'd removed her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining with thread the color of old blood. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Kandahar, 2011 to 2013. 3 tours. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart from a shrapnel wound in her left thigh. Her real history, compressed into a patch the size of a postage stamp, hidden where only she could see it. She'd held the patch in her fist as she'd walked down the corridor, and not once had she looked back. Now, sitting in the darkness of the parking garage with rain hammering the windshield like Morse code, Laura Bennett, Captain Laura Bennett, though no one called her that anymore, tried to remember why she'd chosen the quiet life. She'd left the Marines because she couldn't sleep in barracks full of screaming. She'd chosen nursing because hospitals were quiet in their own way, predictable, a place where blood made sense and suffering had a protocol. She'd imagined herself in scrubs, helping people heal, asking questions about nothing that mattered, keeping her story locked inside where it belonged. But Sterling had needed her gone. Because somehow, her charting had gotten too detailed. Her attention to medication orders had caught a pattern in his surgical billings, a $247,000 discrepancy in anesthesia costs for 3 procedures that didn't match the actual inventory. She'd flagged it in a nurse's note 12 days ago. She'd flagged it to no one, just wrote it down because that's what her training demanded: document everything, leave a trail, tell the truth on paper. She hadn't even known what she'd found. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Sarah's voice came through like a prayer. "Mom, where are you?" "I got on the first flight. I'm landing in 40 minutes. "Where are you?" Laura's voice came out hoarse. "Parking garage. Level 4. Green Honda. Don't move. I'm renting a car now. Stay in the car." The phone went dark. Laura opened the window and let the rain hit her face. Cold. Clean. The kind of rain that had no memory of what it had washed away. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the trembling of restraint finally released, the way a too-taut rope shakes when you cut the last fiber holding it in place. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. Upstairs, on the 3rd floor, Corporal Daniel Jensen was waking up. The nurse who checked his vitals, a young man named Marcus, fresh out of school, was taking his blood pressure when Jensen's eyes flickered open, still groggy from the anesthesia, his chest rising and falling with the assistance of a mechanical ventilator that hissed like a living thing. Marcus smiled and began taking notes on his chart. "Welcome back, Corporal," Marcus had said. "You had quite a night." Jensen's voice came out cracked. Who got me?" "Your nurse. Captain Bennett. She saved your life." The name meant nothing to him yet. Jensen's eyes had closed again, the anesthesia pulling him back under, and Marcus had finished his vitals without noticing the way the patient's heart rate had spiked at the sound of a name that wouldn't register as significant for another 12 hours. Down in the emergency department, an ambulance had arrived at 10:34 a.m. with a 60-year-old man on a stretcher, his abdomen distended, his skin grey with the color of peritonitis. A perforated bowel. Afghan accent thick as smoke when he tried to speak. Refugee status. Coalition cooperator. His name was Reza Yang, and he had lived in hiding for 4 years after testifying against Taliban commanders who'd tried to kill him when the Americans pulled out. He'd survived that. He was not going to survive an untreated perforation. The ED physicians had moved fast, got him to pre-op within 18 minutes, got his chart started, got him hooked to and 4 with 2 liters of normal saline running wide open. During the chaos of handoff, during the precise choreography of nurses and techs moving between stations, someone had placed his chart temporarily in an open locker. The wrong locker. The one in the nurses' station that had belonged to Laura Bennett until this morning. The ID photo was still taped inside. Smaller than a passport, slightly faded, the kind of identification badge that hospitals cycled through every 2 years. Laura's face looked back out from that photo with the expression of someone who had learned not to smile for cameras, neutral, professional, unremarkable. The kind of nurse you'd see and forget you'd ever seen. Reza Yang, waiting on the stretcher outside OR3 while the surgical team prepped, had happened to glance toward that open locker. He'd seen the photo. And his entire body had gone rigid. That woman, he'd said in Pashto, his voice rising. That woman there. That is the captain. The American captain from Kandahar. The translator wheeling his stretcher had looked confused. "Sir, we need to get you to surgery." "No, you don't understand." Reza's hands had lifted off the stretcher, gesturing with the desperation of someone whose memory had suddenly been validated. Evacuation point Echo. During the offensive in 2012. The captain was there. The American woman captain. She held the point for 11 hours while the Taliban attacked from 3 directions. I was there. I was part of her security team. She saved my life. 43 of us. She saved 43 of us. The translator had stopped the stretcher. Other hospital staff had paused. That specific pause, the kind that happens when someone says something that doesn't fit the moment, something too large for the space it's being said in. "What did you say?" the translator had asked. And then Reza had started shouting in Pashto, his voice cracking with something between tears and recognition, pointing at the photograph with his IV-wrapped hand, and within 60 seconds, the story had begun to move like fire through the hospital. The Afghan refugee patient's hands trembled as he held the photograph. Reza Ami had spent 12 years rebuilding his life, had renounced the Taliban, had even worked with coalition forces as a translator and guide. Now he stood in a Seattle General Hospital corridor with his chart in one hand and a 3x5 picture in the other, a woman's face he would never forget, the officer who had held a medevac point for 11 hours while Marines and Afghan civilians bled out around her, refusing to abandon anyone, not even when her ammunition ran low and the mortars walked closer and closer until the dust from the impacts coated her uniform. He began shouting in Pashto, his full line yanking tight, his voice cracking between tears and recognition. The word captain echoed down the hallway like a bell. Within 60 seconds, a nurse had called the nursing supervisor. Within 2 minutes, the shift coordinator was reviewing the photograph against the employee records. Within 5 minutes, the story had begun to move through Seattle General like fire through a dry wheat field, unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. Laura was sitting in her car in the parking structure, still wearing her scrubs, when her phone rang at 3:47 p.m. Her daughter's voice came through breathless, excited, confused. "Mom, they're saying something about you at the hospital. Something about Kandahar. They're trying to find you." Laura didn't answer. She couldn't. She sat with the phone against her ear, listening to her daughter talk, feeling the weight of the faded unit patch that was no longer hidden inside her jacket lining but suddenly, impossibly, pulled into the light. 20 minutes later, she was walking back through the doors of Seattle General, the same doors she'd been escorted out of that morning, and everything felt different. The fluorescent light seemed brighter. The air smelled sharper, antiseptic and hope mixing into something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. Her daughter stood in the administrator's office, hand extended toward a stunned man in a polo shirt with a hospital badge. "Captain Bennett, actually," her daughter said, her voice steady and clear, correcting him mid-sentence as if it were the most natural thing in the world to declare her mother's rank to a room full of people who'd only ever known her as just a nurse. The administrator's face shifted through confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like fear. He stood, extended his hand. Laura didn't take it. She simply nodded, and that small gesture carried more weight than a handshake ever could. "Captain Bennett, we need to discuss your termination. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about." Laura held up one hand. "Not now." 2 words. The room went quiet. Her daughter squeezed her shoulder, and for the first time in 18 years, Laura didn't flinch away from touch. That evening, as Laura was reviewing her former patient charts in the nurses' lounge, charts that suddenly had become important again, charts that proved Dr. Sterling's lies were crumbling, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man in navy dress blue stood there, shoulders the width of a doorframe, bearing the insignia of a SEAL commander. He saluted first, fist to chest, the sound of it sharp and ceremonial in the quiet room. Then he spoke, his voice like gravel and authority mixed. "Captain Bennett earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart in Kandahar, flying medevac support under sustained fire in the Sanjin Valley." He paused, letting each word settle. "I was there. I know what she did." He handed her a letter, official, sealed, marked classified, and left without another word. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ventilation system breathing. 40 minutes later, an FBI agent named Margaret Chen, who'd been interviewing the Afghan refugee patient, pulled Laura aside in a hallway. Chen had the bearing of someone who didn't waste breath on small talk. "Your patient, Corporal Jensen, is lucky. Captain Bennett's evacuation point saved 43 coalition and civilian lives during Operation Enduring Resolve." Chen tilted her head slightly. "That's a significant number. That's not protocol violation. That's valor." She handed Laura a business card. "We're looking at Dr. Sterling's billing records. Your charting is helping us build the fraud case. You document like a military officer documents. Nothing slips past you." Laura took the card and said nothing, but her jaw tightened slightly, not fear, but recognition that the walls she'd built were collapsing faster than she could process. By 6 p.m., Dr. Sterling's face was on the evening news, studio lights making him look like a cut diamond under a jeweller's lamp. 5 million viewers across San Diego watched as he sat across from the anchor, his voice smooth and regretful, his suit tailored and expensive, his demeanor that of a reasonable man forced into an uncomfortable position. "We terminated the nurse because she violated fundamental hospital protocols," he said, his words carefully measured. "Regardless of her claimed military background, which frankly appears exaggerated, we cannot allow unauthorized surgical procedures to continue, no matter the outcome." The anchor nodded sympathetically. Sterling leaned forward slightly, the movement calculated to show vulnerability. "The patient survived, yes, but procedure exists for a reason. Standards protect people." He smiled. "It was a mistake." The producer's voice crackled through his earpiece. The anchor's expression changed, surprise, then something predatory. "Dr. Sterling, we've just received a call. General Marcus Wade from the Marine Corps Command Center is requesting airtime. He says he has relevant information." Sterling's face froze, the smile collapsing like a building with its foundation removed. The general's voice came through calm and measured. "For 5 million listeners, Dr. Sterling's allegations are false. Captain Laura Bennett's service record is verified and decorated across 3 deployments. Her protocol violation was standard combat medicine that saved countless Marines, potentially including the patient in question. She demonstrated exceptional medical judgment under impossible circumstances." The general paused, and in that pause, Sterling's career died. Furthermore, the FBI and CMS have launched a joint investigation into Seattle General Hospital for systematic healthcare fraud involving Dr. Sterling. Inflated surgical billing. Kickback schemes with medical supply vendors. Insurance fraud totaling approximately $2.3 million over 36 months. Captain Bennett's meticulous charting is currently serving as primary evidence. The anchor turned to Sterling, who had begun tugging at his collar. "Dr. Sterling, can you comment on these allegations?" His mouth moved but nothing came out. Then he ripped the microphone from his collar and walked off the set while cameras followed him, capturing the exact moment his entire world collapsed on live television. The hospital administration rushed into crisis mode at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes after the general's statement aired. Security escorted Dr. Sterling from the premises at 7:23 p.m. Federal investigators arrived with warrants at 9 a.m. the next morning, carrying boxes and clipboards and the kind of quiet authority that makes people confess things they never intended to say. By Thursday morning, Dr. Sterling's medical license had been suspended pending investigation. By Friday afternoon, the fraud was undeniable: 3 years of falsified billing codes, phantom equipment charges, vendor kickback schemes documented in meticulous detail. Every chart Laura had filed became evidence. Every note she'd written, every discrepancy she'd flagged, every detail she'd recorded with her military precision, all of it was now a perfect digital trail leading directly to Sterling's corruption. Corporal Jensen gave his statement from a hospital bed, still recovering, still in pain, but speaking with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what Captain Bennett had done for him. "She saved my life using combat medicine. Field thoracotomy. Hands-on cardiac massage. That's what kept me alive long enough to reach the OR." His voice didn't waver. "I'm alive because of Captain Bennett. That's not a protocol violation. That's valor." The statement went into the investigative file. It went into the hospital's legal defense. It went into the narrative that began to replace the one Dr. Sterling had tried to control. 3 weeks later, the formal ceremony took place in the lobby of Seattle General. The hospital CEO stood at a podium before 200 staff members, her voice steady as she read from prepared remarks that essentially admitted the hospital had been wrong and Captain Bennett had been right. "We wrongfully terminated a decorated officer, a skilled medical professional, and a hero. We are correcting that termination immediately, providing full back pay and benefits reinstatement, and more importantly, we are dedicating our trauma bay in her name." Behind her, a plaque gleamed under careful lighting, the Captain Laura Bennett Trauma Center, in honor of service beyond the call of duty. Beneath it, cleaned and pressed and finally displayed without shame, hung the faded unit patch that Laura had carried in secret for 18 years. Corporal Jensen attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, his face pale but present, his posture as straight as pain would allow. When he saw Laura, he saluted, the motion careful but deliberate, his eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide. The Navy SEAL commander was there. The Afghan refugee, Reza Ami, was there, his translator beside him, his voice trembling as he described the American captain who refused to abandon him when she could have left, who held that medevac point against impossible odds because someone needed to. Laura's daughter stood beside her mother, hand on her shoulder, finally able to touch her without flinching, finally able to claim her openly. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the moment when everything became visible. Dr. Sterling's fate was delivered in a follow-up report, 3 months later, after federal charges had been filed and plea agreements negotiated. His medical license was permanently revoked. His fraud settlement cost him $875,000 in restitution. His court-ordered community service sent him to the VA hospital in El Centro, 90 miles east, where he spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, mopping floors in the orthopedic ward, where veterans recognized him and turned their faces away, where his name meant nothing and his credentials counted for zero. That was the punishment karma reserved for him, not prison, not publicity, just the quiet daily humiliation of irrelevance in a place where actual service meant something. Laura gave a brief speech at the ceremony, standing at the podium, her voice steady and clear in a way it had never been when she was pretending to be someone smaller than she was. "I didn't save Corporal Jensen because I'm a hero. I saved him because he needed saving and I had the training. That's all. That's what any competent medical professional with that background would do. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." The hospital went silent. Everyone understood what she meant. Everyone understood that the real bravery wasn't the dramatic gesture of the field thoracotomy, it was the 18 years of silence, the daily choice to be less than she was, the decision to carry her service invisible so she could have something that looked like a normal life. The next morning, at shift change, Seattle General held something unprecedented, a moment of silence. At 7 a.m., every staff member in the hospital stopped work for exactly 60 seconds. Monitors beeped. Ventilators wheezed. But no one moved. No one spoke. Nurses stood still in hallways. Doctors paused in corridors. Orderlies set down their equipment. For one full minute, the entire hospital recognized something that had always been there, had finally been seen, had finally been named. Captain Laura Bennett had come home. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.